Over 1,000 poor garment workers killed in Bangladesh. Is this the tipping point from hell? Can business help such people? And in our Point of View segment, college students demand divestment from fossil fuels companies. In this edition of Business in Society. Welcome to Business in Society. I'm John Palusek, host of the program. It's been called with some irony the Bangladesh tragedy, the tipping point from hell. Tipping point because in the wake of the hellish garment building collapse in Rana Plaza, Bangladesh, killing more than 1,000 workers, Western clothing companies are now making substantial financial commitments to improve safety in such factories. The Rana Plaza tragedy was by no means the first time foreign garment workers have suffered or died working in the global apparel supply chain. This tragic and complex issue has festered for decades, not without progress, but still a vexing challenge for Western apparel companies, labor organizations, governments, and all who care for human well-being. Now, however, many European and American clothing makers and retailers have pledged to improve factory safety significantly. Factory safety is, of course, a very serious matter. But there's another part, an important part of such responsible sourcing. It is the dignity and the overall personal development of the workers themselves. Business for Social Responsibility is a global non-governmental organization that for over 20 years has helped companies in many ways to become more socially responsible and sustainable. It has been especially successful in the globalized apparel supply chain, championing responsible sourcing. Two leading members of the BSR team are here in our New York studio to help us better understand the global context and the prospects for progress in this important business and society issue. Laura Gitman is the Managing Director of Business for Social Responsibility in the organization's New York office. She has worked with multinational companies across a wide range of industry sectors and sustainability issues. In addition to her work for BSR, she facilitated some 50 companies in the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, working to improve conditions in their supply chains. Chavi Gugliani is BSR Manager of Advisory Services with special emphasis on sustainability in emerging markets, including India, Latin America, and the Middle East. He is currently leading BSR's Hair Finance program in India. More about that in a minute. But it is a cross-sector partnership among consumer product companies, their suppliers, local non-governmental organizations, and other stakeholders to bring garment workers into the formal banking system. Welcome, Laura and Chavi.
Thank you, John.
This issue has been festering for a long time. Is it perhaps aspirational to say that we're nearing the tipping point on some sort of meaningful progress in respect to this issue? Laura, what do you think?
You know, John, I don't think so. I do think we're at a tipping point. It's unfortunate that we needed such a tremendous tragedy to get to this tipping point, as there have been signals for many, many years. And while this was such a significant and large-scale tragedy, it certainly wasn't a surprise and was something that many of us could see coming in many respects. But I do think sometimes it takes such a tipping point to be able to get the global media attention, the global consumer awareness, and the systemic investment and collaboration that's required for change. I think a lot of the incremental investments, there have been companies for years that have been investing with a lot of good work in Bangladesh, but it requires much more collaboration than that. And so I'm hopeful that this has spurred that kind of collaboration, and we'll see some real progress coming out of it.
Right. And of course, it's not just a problem in Bangladesh. Chavi, have you seen the kind of encouragement in the countries that you're familiar with and have been active in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you probably know that, the garment sector is mostly women. And so a lot of our work over the past 6 or 7 years with Her Project and Her Finance has been focused on improving the livelihoods of women in global supply chains. So we've done work now in 9 different countries across Asia and Africa through our work. And you hear a lot of the same stories from these women about their aspirations and their dreams. And a lot of the same issues, in fact. You know, I don't think that we've necessarily seen or could have predicted the tragedy that happened in Bangladesh, but you see the fact that there's just a lack of open communication between the workers who work in factories and the people who employ them. There's a lack of investment in workers. Workers don't necessarily feel empowered to ask for their own rights. And we've seen that, you know, it's not a problem that's exclusive to Bangladesh. It's in India, it's in Pakistan, it's everywhere that we've worked.
Yeah. And now we've seen two very important agreements by the clothing manufacturers, retailers, and so forth, the European agreement, or the European-based agreement, and the North American-based agreement. They differ somewhat, and yet they're both seemingly important commitments to make something happen. That's very positive. Is that right?
They are, you know, and I think that's the kind of collaboration that I'm talking about, is that to have an individual company try to make that kind of change, they simply don't have the leverage in the country. But when you've got the essentially the majority of European retailers and the majority of North American retailers now signing on to these commitments and really thinking through the investments that are needed in basic infrastructure to actually build local capacity to meet these requirements and to meet these demands. So it's about having the capacity for local inspectors. It's about understanding how you build new factory buildings that are going to have basic infrastructure and basic safety mechanisms in place. Yeah. It's about making sure that there's a mechanism for worker voice and for worker engagement and involvement, so that workers can play a critical role in ensuring their own safety and in recognizing that their safety is respected.
Yeah. And this is a very broadly based problem, because as I understand it, something like only 2% of the garments or the clothing that Americans wear is manufactured here in the United States, and the rest is imported, obviously, from many of these countries.
Absolutely. I mean, I believe Bangladesh is second only to China in terms of global garment exports, and so and to the United States. And so it's certainly a really significant country for our ability to actually have this industry move forward. And so there's a real mutual dependency between, on the behalf of Bangladesh, their people, their economy, their livelihood is very much intertwined with the success of the garment industry. And for the industry here in the U.S., it's very dependent on the success of Bangladesh to be able to continue the progress they've made, but to be able to do so in a way that's going to be respecting workers' lives and dignity.
And one of the points that BSR has made, I think, very effectively, is that we sometimes forget that the garment workers, women for the most part, really need these jobs. And therefore, any actions, any commitments, any progress has to keep that in mind, because clearly they are, in many cases, very important economic factors in their families. Have you seen that in the countries?
Absolutely. You probably know that the majority of the workforce are women, but they're also young women. I mean, for the most part, they're under the age of 30. And so for many women that work in the apparel sector, in the garment sector, in factories, this might be their first job, or it might be their first formal job, maybe the only way for them to get a salaried wage and all the benefits that come with the salaried wage. And we've met now dozens of women in factories. You know, whenever we start a program, we meet with the women, we try to understand what their needs are. And you hear repeatedly, I mean, why do women work in these factories? It's because they want to be able to provide for their families. They want to have a better life for their children. But the important aspect is that women put themselves through a lot of risk to work in the garment sector. It's not just being in the factory where some of the conditions might be weak, but even getting to a factory. You know, it can take 2 hours to commute to a factory, and it might be by foot. And women face harassment and risk just getting to and from the workplace as well. They feel a lot of pride in being able to contribute back to their households. Women have told us that, you know, they work so that their children can stay in school and don't have to work when they're 12 years old or 13 years old in the informal sector, and they don't have to work in a garment factory when they're 16 years old.
Obviously, there's economic harm inherent in that for women who work in those factories. If their jobs leave the country, obviously, this has a great economic impact on their family life. One of the things responsible companies will say is that we want very much to address this problem, but there are some serious impediments. And very often that goes to the discussion of the fact that the apparel industry, perhaps other industries abroad as well, is based on, yes, the key factory, but also the subcontractor and the subcontractor, perhaps, and several layers down. Do you see in some of these recent commitments the possibility, the hope that that particular problem will be in some way addressed?
Yeah, we need to dig into the implementation plans for the agreements, because I think they're first going to be coming out with what implementation looks like. So depending on what they do, we'll see how they're going to address subcontractors. But I think at a macro level, what's really important is to, at a minimum, get the knowledge of subcontractors out in the open. So in many cases, subcontracting is simply going to be a means of doing business. It's going to be a way for factories to manage changes in workflow, changes in order flow, et cetera. And so it's a part of the system. What we want to prevent is from it being underground. We want it to at least be out in the open so that those subcontractors can also be inspected, so that a brand can make sure that those subcontractors have the same level of conditions and the same level of safety as any factory with where they put their business. What happens now is that they address and monitor and inspect the factory itself, but then a different factory altogether is actually making their goods, and so that their work is actually not addressing the core risks.
That's going to take some time, and it's going to cost some money as well in terms of getting all the way down that supply chain. Yeah. I'm told that BSR has the opinion, perhaps even the documentation, that the costs of that kind of improvement can be addressed at least somewhat, and maybe substantially, by the efficiencies and the improvements that take place in the supply chain when that kind of commitment is made. Talk about that, because I think that's surprising to a lot of folks.
It is, and I think, to be frank, there are going to be some real investments that need to be made that certainly bear real cost, right? And so when basic infrastructure needs to be enhanced, that requires money and that requires investment. And so there certainly are some costs that need to be bore. At the same time, I think there is a false assumption that there always needs to be costs that are then going to get passed on to, that either the factory has to bear, or that will get passed on to the retailer, or that are going to end up getting passed on to consumers. And in many cases, what we've seen is that those costs very much can be, at least once you get past the initial capital investment, they really can be returned through operational efficiency, through better labor productivity, through the ability to attract customers, right? You have a lot of customers right now who are really looking for the better factories, so to speak. And so if you can prove yourself as one of the more desirable, safe factories, you've got a much better opportunity to actually sell more of your work. And so I think there's some really good evidence there. And Chavi can speak to some of the business case data we've seen through the HER project specifically.
Have you seen that, Chavi?
We certainly have. So HER project was launched in 2007 in China and is now active in 9 countries. And before we implement a HER project program in a factory, we always do a baseline assessment, which is a 2 or 3 day assessment of what the current state is in that factory, either of the workers' awareness of health issues or financial issues. And we conduct that same study at the end of our program. It's a roughly 12-month program. And we've been able to show by conducting those assessments at the start and end of our program what the impact is of implementing programs for workers in the workplace. So for example, with HER project, we were able to show that for the factory, every $1 investment in HER project, or investment in worker education or related to health, yielded a $4 return on investment. And that was
$1, $4.
1 to 4, exactly. And that is measured because in the garment sector, turnover is quite high. Absenteeism is quite high because it is a difficult job to do for 8 to 12 hours a day. But when we, through HER project, were communicating to workers about health services that they have available to them, either in the workplace or near the workplace, and basic health issues related to hygiene, reproductive health, we found that absenteeism went down significantly and turnover reduced significantly, and there was better communication overall between management and workers. So workers could raise concerns to management before they became serious issues. And that's where the 4 to 1 return came from.
Well, that's a great transition to the HER project, because I think we need to look at that in the sense of the way it improves obviously the health and the hygiene of the workers themselves, but the dignity, the self-confidence, the personal development, and all of those wonderful things that are so necessary for all of us, really. How would you explain the basic objective of the HER project?
So HER project, through HER project, we collaborate with multinational companies, and these are the international buyers, essentially.
22, 24 companies?
There are about 24 now.
Wow.
And they connect us to their suppliers. So these are garment factories, they might be agricultural suppliers. And we connect those factories to local NGOs to develop and deliver workplace-based peer-to-peer education programs. Mm-hmm. And we focus on health as well as financial capability. And the way that it works is we select a subset of the workforce, not just to train on these issues, but to also turn into peer educators so that they can then train the rest of the workforce as well as people in their homes, in their communities.
Communications networks, but these are in less developed countries very often, so how does that work?
Well, there are very important social networks in developing countries. I mean, very community-based populations, but also in the workplace. These people spend 8 to 12 hours a day, sometimes more, together in the factory. Mm-hmm. And so they build networks within the factory, and we try to take advantage of those.
Is social media coming on at all in this respect?
Social media is very rare. Mobile phone usage is fairly high, but in many cases, mobile phones are not allowed in the workplace, in factories. And so we tend to use a very kind of low-tech solution for the training, because not only do we want to make sure that it works in the workplace, but that whatever training we provide can then be re-delivered quite simply to others in the workplace.
I see. And have you had enough time, have you been at this long enough to measure some impacts of the program?
Yeah, and when we started HER project in 2007, we were very clear that we wanted to be able to measure the impact for everyone involved. So not just the benefit for the workers, but the benefits for the employers as well, in order to make the program sustainable. So I already mentioned the 4-to-1 ROI that the factories are seeing. But for the workers, through the surveys that we've done, we've seen that some basic things like women are much more likely to take advantage of the health services that are already available to them once they're informed that they exist and they're told how to access them. So we found that only 20% of women in factories were using health clinics prior to the HER project program, and that went up to 83% after the program was completed. And so they're able to take preventive measures to reduce illness, to reduce the lost time from work. Women were also much more likely to believe that babies should be born in hospitals, for example. Only 8% of women believed that prior to the HER project training, and that went up to 77%. So these are very significant, tangible benefits from investing in workers. And now we've rolled out the same model to financial capability, so we're delivering financial education to women in factories and connecting them to financial services so that they're better able to make financial decisions for themselves and their families.
Yeah. These are such important advances, but they're kind of overshadowed these days by the issue of the factory safety problem. And you must work very hard, I guess, to get your points across in terms of the corporate support and the partnering and, again, the impacts, et cetera.
Yeah. I would say that we strongly feel that programs like HER project are a very important component of the solution. It's obviously, teaching women about health services and financial services does not address safety issues related to building code violations, etc. But when you empower people with knowledge and information, they are much more confident and they're much more likely to demand their own rights in the workplace. And it goes beyond the workplace as well. It can go into households. But we've seen women gain confidence by attending training sessions. They have a better awareness of what good working conditions look like, because in one factory, if factory management is investing in their well-being, they take that with them everywhere that they go. If they go to another factory, they start to expect the same kinds of benefits. And so they're better able to stand up for themselves once they know that working conditions can be better.
Sorry, the only other thing I would say on that is I think what we've seen as well is that a critical part to any solution, so whether it's a safety issue or whether it's working hours, but whatever the worker issue is in a factory, having good worker management communication and open and trusting relationships is a critical part of the solution, especially in regions where you don't have sophisticated models of labor relations and or access to unions.
It sounds like the messages of the HER project, HER Financial project, and so forth, should resonate well beyond the apparel industry as well, so that any CEOs watching this program, and the young people at the colleges and universities that are studying corporate social responsibility, sustainability, there's an awareness there that's necessary as well. But there is a very, very impressive ray of sunshine in the sense of the kind of work that you people are doing that has not been recognized adequately. So please keep working at it. You know, we don't have an awful lot of time left, but I'm interested in BSR generally because I've been aware of it for a long time, but it seems to me that perhaps BSR and business and society have a common interest in terms of making it clear that today this kind of commitment is good business, okay, and that it is important that it is integrated into the corporate strategies and corporate priorities and business plans. That is an integral part of the BSR mission, is it not?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, at our core, we're certainly about embedding corporate responsibility or sustainability into business, and it needs to be about how business is done as well as what the business is. And so, you know, this example is around supply chain and procurement, and so that would mean that as a company is looking for their next sourcing destination, so what's next after Bangladesh, they shouldn't just be thinking about low-cost labor. They need to be thinking about these other risks and opportunities to make sure they're managing it in a holistic way. But it could just as easily be about what their products are, and are they thinking about the environmental impacts of their products.
There's been some news on that, right? Just this past week in terms of the environmental injury that some of these factories have been perpetrating?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this whole discussion has been focused on labor, but BSR certainly works on it from a holistic point of view, looking at environmental, social, and governance issues. And there's been quite a bit of news recently about the environmental impacts, whether it be about water quality and pollution, or energy efficiency and energy use that's also required for manufacturing, which is an important part of the story as well.
Mm-hmm. And so it's not just CEOs, but perhaps even chief financial officers who ought to be thinking about these terms.
We hope so.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great mission for you, and I'm glad that we can share the mission in some fashion. What's next for HER project and HER Finance?
Well, I think, I mean, if we were to think long term, we would like programs like HER project to be just the way that factories do business, or not just factories, but any supplier does business, that investing in your workforce is just what makes you a world-class organization. So it is not an add-on, it is not a project that has to be sold to a factory, that factory managers it's just the way that they operate. And that's the long-term vision for the program. But to get there, yes, I mean, we have to use the support of our multinational companies that are members of BSR. They're the leverage that we need to have that first conversation with a factory that perhaps isn't really accustomed to having workplace training programs for their workers or having open communication with workers. So we will continue to recruit more companies. And
there are, what, now 280 BSR member companies? Something in that area?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. BSR wide, and I think, and that's across industries, and so it gives us the opportunity
your projects and BSR are a ray of sunshine on this entire set of issues in terms of the supply chain. Thank you very much for coming and sharing your insights and your experience on this important subject.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Back in a moment. Now, our business and society point of view commentary on another vital issue of our time. Divestment. If you are of a certain age, you know well what that word means. In the 1980s, maybe you were one of the bold and brave college students across the country demanding that their institutions divest from the stocks of companies doing business with South Africa under apartheid. We were all shocked by the injustice and suppression of the South African apartheid regime, and we were glad to see that regime fall. Fast forward to today. Many college students are now engaged in a new divestment mission. It's called Divest for Our Future, with thousands of students across the country attempting to influence our climate change policy. They are demanding that their schools divest from stocks of fossil fuel companies. More specifically, the campaign seeks to limit the flow of capital to these companies by making their stocks morally and financially unattractive. Reportedly, it's beginning to get traction among sympathetic mayors, city councils, and churches. The media loves this. What's more appealing than a sincere, articulate young adult making the case for, in their judgment, the students, a better world through renewable energy? But hang on, isn't there a better way to influence climate change policy? First, let's applaud the students' basic goal. They are active, energetic citizens participating in, perhaps now even leading, the public discourse on a critical issue in society, climate change. Even if their divestment demands were to succeed, it's not likely to have the desired effect on climate change. You might be surprised that the apartheid divestment campaign of the 80s is now thought to have had questionable effect on the ultimate outcome in South Africa. Here's a relevant excerpt from the recent Harvard Political Review commentary titled, "Does Divestment Work?" The conventional wisdom is that divestment from South Africa was a success. Public pressure lowered target companies' stock prices and forced them to comply with the divestment activists' demands. However, the true impact of divestment from South Africa is unclear. And what would our society look like if somehow, today's Divest for Our Future campaign succeeded? Is it plausible that renewable energy sources are now ready to largely replace fossil fuel energy? Not very likely. Here's an alternative for the students. Make common cause with the responsible, effective organizations in socially responsible investment. There are many such organizations, but one actually cited by some of the student activists themselves is the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. ICCR, under the banner of Transforming the Corporate World for the Common Good, has waged many successful campaigns in helping companies become more socially responsible and sustainable. Its July white paper, it says, was developed in response to investor requests for enhanced strategies that might be considered in engaging the energy sector to address the serious risks posed by rapidly rising levels of carbon. So here's the heart of the matter. Let's all of us, universities, civil society, government, and business, join the students in shaping, energizing, and sustaining the public debate on climate change. And then, ultimately, let the power of the better argument prevail. That's the business and society point of view.
For more information, please visit businessandsociety.net.